Okay, good morning, everyone, and well done if you've made it here on time. Inclement weather and all that. I want to talk about eucatastrophe in The Lord of the Rings this morning, and I want to connect it with the genre of literature that Tolkien is writing. And you'll recall that when we discussed Lewis and introduced the whole course, the course is called Science Fiction and Subcreation, but we noticed that right at the outset, and when we looked at Lewis's book on, or rather his essay on science fiction, that his type of science fiction, the type of science fiction that interested him, he was very careful in delineating what that was. It's not this, it's not this, it's not this. It ends up being the sort of literature that evokes what we would now call fantasy. So it has a mythic quality to it. So it refers to beings of a sort that have always been mentioned in literature, going back to ancient literature, medieval literature. So speaking of elves and dwarves and dragons and so forth, and yet setting it in the context of a scientific era. That's the sort of science fiction that Lewis himself is interested in. So he's not he's not really writing science fiction. Even when he writes science fiction, it's a particular type of science fiction. And as I said at the time, he does so explicitly in order to point out the shortcomings of the science fiction that does not include those things. And thereby he pulls in, among other things, the law of humanity, as he calls it, or the moral law, or as he coins it in The Abolition of Man, the Tao. So the understanding that there's a natural awareness of moral goodness and moral evil that has been present in the world all the way up till the mid-19th century. And I mentioned in Lewis, furthermore, that in this his address as when he was installed as lecturer at Cambridge University as professor of medieval and Renaissance studies, a chair that was made for him, by the way. So it was, and so he spent most of his years at Oxford with Mr. Tolkien, but then he moved over to Cambridge when they offered him this chair. And in that, and it's typical for this when you're installed as a chair, you give a lecture, a public lecture, and the lecture was called On the Description of the Ages. And it's a fascinating lecture, and I think very important insofar as it talks about the how literature ought to be approached in terms of ages, so chronologically. So we'll study it in terms of the development of ideas over time. So for instance, here at Tyndale, you'll notice that we will have courses in medieval literature. There'll be Anglo-Saxon. We're not offering it currently, but it's on the book, so the approach is there. Anglo-Saxon, medieval, Renaissance, 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, and so forth. So it's approached in that sort of temporal way. That's the way that Lewis and Tolkien advocated. And as I said, with Mr. Tolkien in particular, he brought Anglo-Saxon within the canon of English literature, largely because of his studies in Beowulf and his argument that Beowulf ought to be considered an epic on par with that of the Odyssey, the Iliad, the Aeneid, and so forth. So this was the quintessential English epic, was Tolkien's argument. But I don't need to revisit that. We looked at that in The Monsters and the Critics and so forth. But Lewis, in writing on Descriptione Temporum, talks about not just the differences over ages, but more importantly, the commonalities. And he notes, come the 19th century, sometime, he says, in the mid-19th centuries, there is a big shift towards what we will now call the contemporary view. I think other critics call it the shift from a classical to a romantic viewpoint. A critic of the 19th century, contemporary of Lewis, writes an essay called Classicism and Romanticism, and this is his argument. T.S. Eliot is more or less in agreement with him, that there's a big shift from the classical worldview to the romantic worldview, and within that, there is what Lewis calls the abolition of man. So the romantic worldview, what Hume calls romanticism, it abolishes the Tao. So there's a rejection of the idea that there's a moral, a morality within nature, and that all creatures live in accordance with it, and that furthermore it's interwoven into the fabric of the cosmos, and if we rebel against it, we rebel against our own nature, and the consequences are dire. But Lewis notes that it transpires sometime in the middle of the 19th century, so calling it romanticism is not strictly accurate, insofar as romanticism begins way back in the mid or the early 18th century. It's expressed in the English romantic poets, mostly through Wordsworth and Coleridge, and that's in 1789 area, the time of the French Revolution. And the reason that I say this is the Romantics still talk about a sense of moral goodness in nature. So they haven't rejected wholly the idea that there's an important goodness within the natural or the cosmic realm. They haven't wholly rejected it. But what they have done, that is the Romantics, is that they have shifted the view of the imagination to that of the author and detached the author's imagination from the imagination of God. So they speak of themselves, and when they talk about imaginative writing, it's almost like they take on divine attributes themselves. So they create ex nihilo, more or less. That's the claim that they make. And Wordsworth goes so far as to say that all good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. The spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. It's not the reflection on, it's no longer what it would have classically been, which is mimesis. This is the doctrine of the classical era. You represent, or mimesis or representation. This is a good way of putting it. Sorry, this is a little bit theoretical, but you are representing in your work something that is already there, and you're simply seeking to capture it and artistically, faithfully represent that work. So the Greek word is mimesis for this. And in M.H. Abrams, another literary critic, so I'm throwing a lot of literary critics at you here, but there's a conceptual shift here. Abrams, in his magisterial work on the Romantics, The Mirror and the Lamp, describes the shift in terms of those two objects. The classical aesthetics of mimesis is likened to a mirror. So, to use Shakespeare's words, we hold the mirror, he says it is as 'twere to hold a mirror up to nature and show her her true self. That's the artist's aim. It's to hold the mirror up to nature. When he means nature, what does he mean by nature? He means not everything that can be seen, but the essence of what's there. That's what he means by nature. So it's the nature of nature. That's what Shakespeare means by it. It's the nature of nature. What is the nature of nature? For Shakespeare, it's clear that it's something that's been created by God. So what is the essence of nature? Well, it bears the mark of its maker. It has, God is good, so it has a moral order structured into it. And if you defy the moral order, all chaos breaks loose. And Shakespeare repeatedly demonstrates this in his plays, usually through political rebellion. So if somebody rebels against the divinely appointed authority, think of Macbeth. He slays his king. When he does so, he acts unnaturally. Actually, the word nature is repeatedly used in King Lear as well. The idea of nature and unnatural, it's the dominant term in that. But this is a rebellion not only against a lawfully appointed authority, so a social construct, but it's actually against the laws of nature itself, because God has appointed those kings to be in their place. And so to seek to overthrow them is to constitute a breach with God himself, not just with the king. It's a sort of a moral rebellion. So the mirror there is not, don't think of it just simply in the sense of showing everything in it, because if we held up a mirror, we would see everything in it. They mean it's very specific. It represents the nature of nature, or the nature of the world. That's what a good artist does. Always was so in classical aesthetics and in Christian aesthetics, all the way up until sometime in the mid-18th century, at which point it shifts to what Abrams calls the lamp, in which what is being portrayed is not the goodness out there, but rather the goodness that comes out of the poet. And it's like a lamp. The light comes from within and shines out. So it moves from a poetics of representation to a poetics of self-expression. It's a really important shift. It has a profound effect on education. It has a profound effect, I would say, on Christian theology as well. It's a move towards individualism and a move away from the authority of Scripture, furthermore. It's the beginning of liberal theology. It's concurrent with it. It happens at the same time. It's not what the text says. It's not what the Word of God says. It's my feelings in response to what I read. That's the real text. I'm the text. I exegete my feelings and I express my feelings. So I sit in a Bible study and I don't talk about what the words say. I talk about my response to the words. And everyone in the Bible study talks about their response to what they're reading and their feelings about it. That's a romantic approach to the text. It mirrors the romantic approach to art. They express the light within themselves in response to the world, but they are the main object of discussion. As I say, modern psychology arises out of this. So we become the main text to be studied. We turn our eye inwards and regard ourselves as the most important thing to be studied. We're the real essential reality, not God any longer, not the way God has been, his goodness has been displayed in the created order, as Romans 1 says it, but rather ourselves, and then there are different, in the Romantic period, different accounts of how the fall happens. So our original goodness is darkened by various means. But there's this huge shift that takes place in this period. But in De Descriptione, going back to Lewis, in De Descriptione Temporum, Lewis says that the shift that really begins with Romantic aesthetics becomes distinctive and breaks with the past in the mid-19th century, and I think this is accurate. So the seeds have been sown already by the Romantic revolt against classical aesthetics, but it doesn't come to fruition until the mid-19th century, at which point he notes that the idea of the machine becomes dominant within the writing of artists. So it shifts from repeating what God has done in an artistic way. We can't do anything new or original or good. The best we can do is repeat what God has done because it is good. How can you make it better than what's already good? Think of Iluvatar and how Melkor wants to sing his own song. It's almost a description of romanticism. So not sing the song that's already been laid down like everyone else. He wants to sing his own song, and there's just a slight discrepancy, but over time it becomes, the discord becomes apparent. And Lewis notes that it's in the mid-19th century when this idea of the machine and the metaphor of the machine serves to show how human progress has been achieved through the machine. And so we start using increasingly mechanistic and machine-like comparisons for human progress. In fact, the devices that some of you are tapping on and I'm recording on are a symbol of human progress. Not just technical progress, but human progress. We connect the two together without discrimination. So if you want to prove that we're superior to ages past, just pick up your cell phone. There's the proof right there. Because, and note that the technological progress is linked to the progress of our intellects. So it becomes a disembodied spiritual sense of ourselves connected with machines, wedded to machines, in fact. Rather than the world in which we live, in which we have human bodies, it's wedded to the machine and the model of the machine. I'm going to talk about that in this class. But note that when that happens, there is a transformation in the view of what human nature is as well. It's the transhumanist thing that we talked about, we trace back in Lewis's work. Remember Weston and his move at first from a species-defined progress to a more broad, all-life embracing spirituality, as he called it. But the spirituality is at war with all of creation now and all physical being. So there's a spirit against the body. So now it becomes a war, and if you watch the Terminator, of the machines against the created order. And Tolkien depicts this throughout The Lord of the Rings. But note that I think that both men are, and I've tried to condense it here in a very pithy way, both men are talking about a shift in sensibilities over what constitutes true humanity. And they are holding up the old moral order of God's good created order against the social construct of those who are believing that we can create our own identity, our own human nature, and it will be superior to that which was created. And then they'll give various examples of it. And we saw them last time. One of them is extended life, in fact, immortality. Another is to be able to see into the future. Another is to control the past. So start talking about the past in such a way that you actually ignore what happened and present a new version of it. All of these are ways of dominance and control, and all of them have in common a will to power, as Nietzsche called it. Nietzsche, who although he was a classical scholar and a terrific translator, by the way, was a Greek scholar. Not quite the translator that Schleiermacher was. He translated Plato's works into German. But all the same, a terrific classicist, but in very much the romantic vein, I think. Focusing, well, what's really important in the work is my response to it. That's the most important thing. Never mind what others thought. I want to be like the Übermensch. You ever heard of this phrase? Übermensch? Does this mean anything to you? Have you heard this before? You may not have. Okay. In his work, Thus Spake Zarathustra, he speaks of the idea that he will submit to no man's ideology, and his ideal man will be this Superman, Übermensch, usually translated as the Superman, a superior human being that will be subject to no one and nothing. He will make his own ideology. The Nazis loved Nietzsche, by the way. And when they spoke of the Übermensch, they thought they were the Übermenschen. And so that they were no longer constrained by the moral order as humanity had been in the past, because of course they were the superior species. Their own technological progress, their own culture demonstrated that. And therefore, they could exterminate those who were inferior humans. Untermenschen. Who are the Untermenschen? The subhumans. The Jews, the Gypsies, the Slavs. Untermensch? It's just the opposite of Uber. Unter. So they dehumanize other human beings. This is the language. Subhumans. And of course, they're superior humans. Now they've divided humanity into those that are more human and those that are less human. But there can only be one true humanity, and the true humanity must trample down what's inferior. Note that the Nazis, by the way, I've noted this often, they were strongly wedded to environmentalism. Environmentalism is very strong in Nazi Germany, because they thought they were expressing the nature of nature. The others were, think about this, and it's still, the ideology is still there if you listen to contemporary eugenics movements and their expression through genetic manipulation and producing people that don't have genetic defects and so forth. What they want to eradicate is people who are defective. Note that the understanding of defective is one that they have to invent. And when we say defective, there's nobody in this room who isn't a defective person. I had asthma as a child. I ended up having, I needed glasses, those sorts of things, but everybody will have something like that, like a physical defect. There's also the moral defects, the character defects. So it's true of everyone that they have these things. The Nazis' regime and the program there is to get rid of those biological defects, which are the root, they think, of moral defects, and thereby to create a master race. Now, if you want to see a parallel there, then look at what Saruman does by marrying the orcs with elves, and he creates the fighting Uruk-hai. This is a sort of eugenics program, and it's an attempt to express the nature of nature, but to do it through technology, and I can liken it to the Frankenstein novel that we read at the outset. So he's tapping into this same attempt of humans to make humanity more human. That's what they're doing. So they do it not in the name of evil, but in the name of a good. We're going to make what is good better by getting rid of what's worse. But Tolkien and Lewis both see this as diabolical, which it is. So in the name of humanity, they say actually they're dehumanizing. Remember that Weston, just like Frankenstein, saw himself as a humanitarian. He was advancing humanity and its human rights. He was redefining what that would mean. And in fact, when he does that, he has no means of doing so. Like no stable definition. It's a moving target. So once we've created this and we have created this new being, then we'll tell you what the good is, because it's not connected with anything previously good, because that was the Tao and we've rejected the Tao. You'll find the same idea expressed in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, in which people are hatched, in which there's no more mother and father. The words have been banished. There's no more natural parenting. And you'll note the contemporary relevance and application to this in contemporary social policies. Ontario government got rid of the words mother and father from family law. Bill 89. It's eradicated. So now we have parents, and you can have up to 4, by the way. And the parents have a legal relationship to the child, but no longer a natural one. It's anyone can be the parent. Some people think it's part of a gay agenda. I think that's only partly correct. I think it's a broader and more insidious thing than that. It is an attempt to take control of life by an elite that wants to play God. And you can only do that if you get rid of all natural connections. right? That's how we will advance human nature, through the state and its orchestration of things in league with the scientists, just like in Nazi Germany. So the intellectual elite working with the means of government in order to improve human nature by changing human nature without any say, okay, well, and this is all in the name of progress. Well, what is the goal then that we're progressing towards? They can never define it. Progress means eradicating the goodness of what already exists. So it's a revolt against creation. And it seeps into evangelical theology when the Creator is denied. So we'll talk about God, but we won't speak of him as Creator anymore, let alone Father. It's a rebellion against creation. So this progressive ideology is connected with a rebellion against the very idea that God has a sovereign relation to everything that exists as Creator. He is the one who made it. The reason why this is necessary, by the way, in the view of the progressives who are connected with those that bear the inner light within the lamp, or the romanticists, or those who produce or connect and further transhumanism, is because the idea of a Creator implies a natural and legitimate authority over everything, and we have to get rid of that. There can be no word that suggests the legitimacy of the created order, whether through God as Creator or through Father as the author, as it were, of his offspring, or Mother as the author of her offspring. We can't have any of those natural words anymore. We have to redefine the family. We have to redefine human nature. We have to redefine progress. We have to redefine goodness. Now, all of these we will recognize, having done this course, as privations of the good. Note that there's nothing really there which is being furthered that you can point to. There's nothing you can identify as a new good. It's simply a twisting, a distortion, a perversion of the old good. So it's like a parasite on the good. So progress is, if that's true, progress is defined by what we're moving away from, not what we're moving towards. So I just threw a whole lot at you. I gave you half an hour, more or less, of extended thought. Looking around at the kernel of the whole course, I think it's a central core issue. And it's a core issue not only in the course, it's a core issue in human ethics today, it's a core issue in education today, it's a core issue in politics today. It will dominate your lifetimes. The reason I think this course is an important course is because the substance of the course, which is expressed in what is usually just called fiction, is actually an extended reflection on the reality in which we live and breathe and move and have our being. So it's a very, very contemporary commentary. And it has not become less so with the passage of time. So when you read Lewis or Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, it feels like a commentary on today. Just like Frankenstein reads like a commentary on today. And Lewis's science fiction reads like a commentary on today. And that's because it is. So ignore the trappings of this is set back 6,000 BC, although it is clearly. Ignore the fact that Lewis's works, whether in Narnia, which we haven't really discussed much, or in his sci-fi, seems to be a little bit dated in its understanding of technology. It really reads like a contemporary commentary, and that's why people think that they are the authors that they look to Christians, that is, and even people who aren't Christians, when they read them, they think, that's really speaking to me right now in the world as I see it. Comments or questions? Yes.
I love what you said at the start.
What did I say at the start?
The artist's aim is to hold a mirror up to nature.
Okay, yeah.
Now, up until you said the mid-19th century?
No, in the mid-18th century.
Mid-18th century.
Yeah, so Lewis in De Descriptione Temporum says that come the mid-19th century, the shift is towards the machine. And the idea of whatever is newest is best, which we all actually intuitively assume. Why? Because we look at the newest things and they work better. Like your phone from 5 years ago is a brick, so we call it. Whereas, and it probably is, it doesn't work anymore. Like it literally doesn't, it's become obsolete. That idea, which is connected to, this type of technology, we apply it as a metaphor to everything. He says that this begins in the mid-19th century. So that's Lewis's comment. My comment is it goes back to a certain type of aesthetics, and this is Abrams' observation. It shifts from the aesthetics, the classical aesthetics of the mirror, to the romantic aesthetics of the lamp. So this book is really key in identifying that.
You've just given me great hope, because I'm an outdoor photographer,
Okay.
and I had always hoped that through my images of moments of magic that I've captured in God's great outdoors, others would at least see the glimpse of the grandeur.
Sure.
But that's as far as I had developed my thinking in it,
Yeah.
and that's all I could ever say. When
The problem with photography is that how will you know that you're working with this aesthetics rather than that
other
aesthetics?
than the lamp.
You can't really. And we'll say the difference between this photographer and that photographer is this photographer's subjective capacity to capture that, right? Rather than capturing something out there, he's capturing what is within himself. So he's giving his feelings are being expressed. But you can see it in the painting of the period, like Monet. He'll do a natural painting, right? Well, look at Monet's paintings. Everything's sort of obscure, right? Intentionally. It has this sense of you're looking through like a camera lens on which the water has sprinkled, so it's a little bit obscure. Yeah, but the feeling of the artist is being expressed there. So he's looking at nature, and really it's expressing his feelings, not something within nature. We could look at this artistically as well. I do that on other courses. Not here because we're looking at Tolkien and Lewis. But the depiction is correct, and the shift of sensibilities takes place in the mid-18th century, probably with Rousseau. But it gets expressed most importantly in English writing in William Wordsworth. So Wordsworth becomes the key author of Romanticism in Abrams' reckoning, and I think this is correct. But in Wordsworth's reckoning, nature is still good, whereas by the mid-19th century, that is gone. That's Lewis's point. By the mid-19th century, what is good is what is new, and what is new is not what's old. That's what makes it, right? And so there's an original goodness. Creativity is now defined as, well, originality, which never would have been thought when the classical aesthetics of the mirror reigned. Never. If you told Shakespeare he was highly original, he would be insulted. When I teach Shakespeare, which I'll do again next year, we can see that Shakespeare is very much coming out of the medieval dramatist tradition, and he is basically repeating other people's stories. As is Tolkien and as is Lewis, by the way. They're taking old stories and they're refashioning them because they think there's something good that's there. Why they don't have to reinvent the wheel? A great illustration of this is Sauron breaking the white light in order to, and he's woven in a coat of many colors. And Gandalf says to him, I preferred the white. I don't have my books with me. And Saruman's response is that white is good. He doesn't say it's good. He talks about the naivete of that. And then Gandalf's commentary on, actually no, it's Treebeard's commentary on Saruman, is that he has a mind of metal. it's meant to be a strong repudiation of what Saruman does. So he's divorced his actions from the created order of Iluvatar. He demonstrates that he's fallen under Melkor's original sin of trying to sing his own song. It's a song of discord. You can't change goodness. You can't change beauty. You can't change truth. But that's the aim and the intent. I've spent a lot of classes talking about how evil is the parasite on the good, how it distorts it, how it cozies up to the good, and it comes under the guise of goodness. The good characters think that they're doing something that's good, and they're tricked. They're deceived by the corruption of their hearts. So it's not presented as an evil, it's presented as a good. They're going to do some good, and the good characters realize they can't use the Ring of Power. They're going to throw away the technology. They're never going to pick it up because they recognize that to do so would to try and become the creator themselves and have all power, determine what nature is, and they know that this is not a path open to them. The only thing they can do is destroy it and turn their backs on it. Yes?
That's like Sauron shows up to the elves as the giver of gifts in the sky.
Yes.
Shows you up to
Yes.
good because the elves have retained their allegiance to Iluvatar and are thus still able to.
Well, there's a yes and no. The only reason they're deceived is because actually they secretly desire that. That's why. So that those that are lured away, and the elves, we see the elves as, the good characters. Some have been mistakenly seen them as angelic beings because they seem to have a superhuman capacity. Like in the movie version, Legolas is jumping around and flying through the air, and arrows going all over the place, and he seems stronger, and he can walk on snow and all this sort of stuff, right? But that's not how they're presented in the book. That's not how the elves are portrayed. They are in some ways the most beautiful of the creatures. There's a wisdom there, but there's also a sinful lust for power in them as well. Like they decided to leave where they were, and that's why they're on Middle Earth.
They forged their spheres, and then
Right.
they were just deceived into.
It doesn't mean that they're not a little bit better than the others, but they're not good.
I wasn't saying.
No, I know you weren't.
Yeah.
I'm just clarifying. But I'm going to talk about the movie version next time, so I won't get off topic on that. Yes.
It's interesting what Jaden just said, because as I think back to the Silmarillion, that's how Sauron presented himself to Numenor.
Of course.
The same way.
Yes.
He came as a servant.
Yes.
With his knowledge.
Yes. It happens to this day.
And they were completely deceived.
Yes. Well, the addict, even, does not initially do something out of a sense of an evil. They do it out of some perceived good. And the depiction of addiction that I've read is that they're chasing the first high. Like the first time they try a drug, whatever it is, there's this euphoric experience that arises out of it. And thereafter, they're trying to, in order to recover that, they have to take a little bit more and a little bit more. And they're trying to get that original experience, and it never comes. And to get close to it, though, they have to increase whatever it is that they're doing, whatever drug, whatever activity, to experience that, and they never get it. So the more they seek to and control the experience of the perception of something beautiful, whether it's sort of a sense of, as I say, euphoria, you're carried up out of your own body and you're forgetting your circumstances and you feel great, you've forgotten all of your troubles. The more you do that, the more you come under the sway of the idol that you've put in the place of God. And the harder you find it to break it. And then everyone else around you can see that's an addict. That's not how they see it. And so part of the therapy for an addict is to get them to recognize God, the Creator. It's there in AA. You have to acknowledge that there's a God, a Creator, because then you're not it, and there's a goodness there. Because before, your bottle was your God. Your addictions and everything around you, your family has been there, and they're there to support you in your addiction. It's a common idol worship. Everyone gets sucked into it, into a spiral of despair and ruin, and until they break that, it doesn't end. Or it does end. It ends in their total destruction. But Tolkien portrays this everywhere with all of the creatures. So if they will not band together to totally reject evil, they will invariably become evil themselves through corruption. It's not possible to use power to hold off evil. It's something that will corrupt the best of them. The only decision that can be made is for evil to be destroyed. Now, I said last time when we were talking about temperance that the three means of, or the three types of intemperance are the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life, which are the three temptations that Jesus faced in the wilderness, which I'm currently, or I just finished lecturing on in Paradise Regained in my Milton class. Those are the exact three temptations that he withstood. And it's very interesting to see authors from very different eras really talking about the nature of corruption and sin and the means of resisting it, which is that you cannot seize power yourself. You must give it up. And remember, Jesus himself did precisely that, though he was, by his very nature, God, considered equality with God something not to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant, right? You know the passage I'm talking about. So he became, and gave himself up willingly to death. And therefore God exalts him, because he rejects all earthly power. And it's not because Jesus didn't have a right to the authority that would have been given to him. It was because he wanted to destroy sin and death. And that was the means to do it. And it's also the means in the Lord of the Rings. So it's a commentary on the most important thing about human nature, really. A reflection on what happens at the cross. I just find that endlessly fascinating and important to living our lives today in an era of technology and the great power that is at our fingertips that comes with it, which just becomes so common that we don't even think about it. Everybody's on their smartphones. It's the way you communicate. It gives great, wow, it's great. I can contact anyone, anywhere, instantaneously. It's really useful. It is very useful. It's hard to imagine life without it. It becomes an idol. Yes?
When you said they have to increase what they're doing, the more they seek to control the perception of something beautiful, the more they come under the sway of it.
Yeah.
I just realized, I think that's what Lewis managed to condense into a single sentence: the sweet poison of the false infinite.
Oh, I like that.
Well, that was in the literature you gave us to read.
Yeah. But
He
the
quotes
phrase
that
is great.
in membership.
Yes. The sweet poison of the false
Yeah.
infinite. I mean, it's a very academic expression, right? But that's exactly it. And it's the very same thing that Augustine meditates on, and some people see as characteristic of Lewis's own writing, this expression of Zeinzuk, the longing for the infinite, the longing for God, which Augustine expresses in his Confessions. Lord, you've made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. So there's this longing for God, which we seek to gratify in all manner of things around us. And anything other than God will meet one of those three descriptions. Either it will follow the lust of our eyes, it will follow, or the lust of the flesh, rather. It will follow the lust of our eyes, or it will be conducive to the pride of life, and none of them are finding their rest in God then. It's a rest in something that we have control over, or seek to have control over. And they're all idols. So it's a consistent Christian witness. And Lewis and Tolkien are, I think, profound in their discussion of that. And this is why they So, let me go back to the original question. I talked about eucatastrophe. We'll come around to that. But let's talk about the genre in which this was written, The Lord of the Rings. Because I said at the outset, Lewis writes in his little essay on science fiction that when he writes science fiction, he's really interested in it only in those types of science fiction that have a commonality with the myths of old. That whether it's Norse mythology or Greek and Roman mythology or any old mythology, that's what he's interested in. He's interested in supernatural beings, right? In God, in supernatural beings, in a goodness that is in nature. It's the nature of nature. And the nature of nature is actually not in nature. It's in God who created it. So it's not in the nature. That's the Romantics' error, by the way. They posit God in nature. They think the nature is God. The error is called panentheism. All is in God, God is in all. Whereas Abrams writes in another book describing Romanticism, he calls it natural supernaturalism. It's actually not his phrase, it's Thomas Carlyle's, but so it's supernatural in nature. So God is in nature. This is a theological error of the first order. Nature is not God. God created nature, he's not in it, he's outside of it. By the way, if he is in it, then he couldn't redeem it. Couldn't. He would have been caught up in our sin. So when Jesus takes on a body, it's a perfect body. It's a sinless body. God is outside the created order, outside of space and time. He creates it and he looks upon it outside of space and time, so that means that he can see the past, the present, and the future without the conditions that we have for bodily existence. But 2018 years ago, he took on a human body. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory. That's not natural supernaturalism. That is God's breaking into the natural order and demonstrating something that the natural order no longer reflects perfectly because of sin. It's broken. This is the true infinite, not the false infinite. Right? The false poison of the... Yeah. So when Lewis and Tolkien are writing about nature and the power of nature, don't think that they're thinking that nature is a divine thing. That is romanticism. That is not what they are. Some have called them Christian romanticists. I think this is a grave mistake. They are not furthering the romantic project. They are connecting with the classical worldview, not the romantic shift. They're writing about the myths of old. They're writing about biblical truth. They see a consonance there between the two. They're not the same. Grace perfects nature. It's not that nature is a witness without contradiction. It needs to be perfected by grace and understood in the light of grace. So God transforms, as we've just seen, discussing Tolkien's view of the virtues, they're transformed by Christianity. So temperance is no longer the medium between two extremes. It is the tempered, chastened, suffering, long-suffering pursuit of the good. That's what temperance becomes. Not abstinence from good, but goodness suffering in the face of evil and being obedient. And we saw the same thing with justice and mercy and prudence. They all get changed by Christianity. But they're not totally out of step. So there is something good in the created order. It needs to be redeemed. But Lewis notes that for Christians, we have more in common with the ancient world, the ancient pagans, than we do with our contemporaries. That's also his comment in De Descriptione Temporum. So for Christians, we actually have more in common in the way that they look at the world and the way they look at nature than do our contemporaries. So our contemporaries are rebelling against existence, against the created order as it's been given, through their weddedness to the machine and their devotion to the goodness of the machine and their commitment to transhumanism. He says this is a breach of the first order against the past, the good, and against God. It is a heresy of the first order. It's a sort of a Gnosticism. That's one other way of seeing it. Many theologians have talked about the Gnosticism that becomes characteristic of the modern era. I could give you all sorts of sources on that. I don't want to take too much time, but it's a strong and regular theological observation in politics and in the realm of theology, in the realm of ethics. If you're interested, ask me afterwards, and I'll give you various sources to explore that. But let me talk about the particular style and genre. So I said when Lewis writes, I keep circling back and then digressing, and so back again. The genre is science fiction of the fantastic variety. Fits with fantasy, fits with mythology. You get the sense that these guys are myth makers. I'm going to take this thought from, what's his name? Tom Shippey. There's another commentator on Tolkien, contemporary with Tolkien, of some variety. He came later, but there's a little bit of overlap here. He was an Anglo-Saxonist, so he's really helpful in tracing the words that Tolkien uses to describe his creatures, among other things. But his commentary on the style and genre of The Lord of the Rings. Let me talk about this. He refers to Tolkien's contemporary and the great Canadian critic, Northrop Frye, which I had the pleasure of hearing years ago. And his great literary work, the one that put him on the map, was The Anatomy of Criticism. It's an M. And in this, he delineates 5 types of literature, literary modes, rather. 5 of them. Now, as I say, he writes this almost, it gets published almost contemporaneously with Tolkien. So it's not a commentary on Tolkien, but I think you can see the resonance of Frye's typology with Tolkien's own work. And I will note one final thing on that front. Jordan Peterson is currently looking at psychology in typological ways. He's getting this partly from Frye, but more from Carl Jung, who sees it in psychology as well. And so he reads the Bible as an archetypal commentary. And note how potent and wise Peterson is being seen as this day. But he's tapping into this view. Yes?
He's being called a preeminent scholar.
Yeah, the preeminent public intellectual of our day. And he may well be. He's only got 2 books. Note that the number of publications has nothing to do with your profundity or wisdom. I mean, it could, but there's no correlation. Sure output doesn't mean anything, quite frankly.
Despite all those students with their placards
Sure.
demonizing him.
Well, I'm not surprised. One final thing. I noticed this in my lecture on human rights, which I did for the Sophia Society. I'll bring it to your attention again. When we talk about human, I can't use the word of it, the way we used to talk about adults having children we would talk about begetting. That's the old language. It sounds obsolete. Certainly antiquated, old-fashioned these days to speak about begetting. I begat a child. If I said that, people would laugh. Right? Christians will, you don't want to sound quite so old-fashioned, so we can talk about procreation. Well, that's very Latin as opposed to Germanic. And it still sounds a little bit weird to contemporary listening. I procreated. No, did you? Yeah, okay. Really? I procreated a child. Oh, wow. Okay. So what do we do? Well, we reproduce. We talk about reproduction. If you talk about human biology, they'll talk about reproduction. That's the language even in biological textbooks. What do you note about that final term? It's the same for machines. You can reproduce machines. It's this exact copy. There's no uniqueness, no individuality. It's a reproduction. It's the exact same thing, reproduced infinitely. Individuality goes with it. It fits with the machine age. The term referred to in human biological textbooks is reproduction. Whereas these two have the implication of a connection between God and humanity, and not a total human control. And there's an individuality which is being erased by the machine age, where everybody's an individual and yet they all are the same. They have the same views, and they won't tolerate the old individualistic ethics, which are actually community ethics and family ethics. But in the anatomy of criticism, he talks about different genres of literature. And so let me delineate these for you. By the way, this comes out in 1957, The Anatomy of Criticism. But he talks about various genres. The top of them, and these are in order, by the way, is myth. When Lewis and Tolkien talk about myth, this is what they mean. If we see them as myth makers, first of the categories is myth. I'll talk about this more in the Bible as literature as well, by the way.
Really? Yes.
Yeah. Because for years, Fry wrote on the Bible as literature. He wrote 2 books on it, in fact. I don't think that Fry was orthodox in his Christianity, but his literary acumen was very perspicacious, very helpful. So the first type of writing is that of, or literary mode is that of myth. Now, what are the characters within myth? This is key. Mythological characters work, and I quote, are they're superior in kind, both to other men and to the environment of other men. So they're superior in kind. So the hero is a divine being, in other words. Not in degree, in kind. The hero is a divine being. The story about that character will be a myth. So in that sense, the gospel is a myth. In that literary sense, note that we're not saying it's made up and it's not true, but it's as Lewis received it, and this is how Tolkien presented to Lewis the Christian faith and brought him to Christ. He said, I hear what you're saying about myths, and you're saying that these are lies breathed through silver, but I'm telling you Christianity is a true myth. And then he got it. He said, yes, there you go. So this is actually, it is a myth. It is talking about a divine being, but this one happens to be true. And the penny dropped for Lewis. So it's a true myth. He didn't think it was a fiction that was made up like when we think of myths, untrue things. So but he's thinking about a genre of literature long before Fry describes this. That's the first type. The second is romance. So the myth, the heroes are different in kind. Godlike, or they are gods. Not just the Greek. Those are myths. So the ancient Greek myths have gods appearing, Athena and so forth. Christianity will, in the Gospels, will also present Jesus in a mythological way in this sense, that it's a being different in kind. Note that it's not only that, because Jesus is also man. So that's why it's a true myth. It's a category that defies it. It's a true myth. You'd want to actually place this above this, the sixth category. But Fry he's describing literature in general, the commonalities. The Gospels are unique. This is a category of literature that did not pre-exist this. And it's the only one of its type. But the first category of Fry is myth. The second type is romance. Here, the characters, the heroes, are different in degree. Or not just different. I will say different is politically correct. They're superior in kind. Here they are superior in degree. And under this genre, which is Fry's description of it, they are superior to other men as well. What type of characters are we describing here? Well, those that will fall under the genres of the epic and the tragedy. So Aeneas is a man, but he's godlike Aeneas. Achilles is a man, but he's superior in degree to other men. But he's still a man. Same with Odysseus. He's half human, half divine. There's something that's superior about him. Oedipus, in the tragedy of Oedipus the king, is a king. Aristotle says that a tragic hero has to be like us, but superior. He's better than us, not just in his station, he's a king, but he has to be more virtuous. And that thereby we sense his fall, because he's above us, we see how he falls below us, commits an utter degradation, incest, kills his father. What a fall. This is a good man. So he is superior in degree, but not kind. So he's now the heroes of romances are humans. Here they are gods. Third category is what he calls, I believe it's high mimesis. Oh, I've got this wrong. The high mimesis is actually the high mimesis is the epic. So in high mimesis, the heroes or the heroines are superior in degree to other men, but not their environment. Okay, superior to godlike, superior in degree to men and environment. That was my mistake. Superior in kind to men and environment. I should have read the whole thing rather than seeking to abbreviate it. Superior in degree to men and the environment. In high mimesis, they're superior in degree, not in kind. Superior to men, not environment. Environment. Shit. Anyway, you know how to spell environment. Even if I can't spell environment. And these are the epic and tragic heroes. They're subject to the conditions of their age. And they're superior to other men, but they're not superior, they're not above nature. They can't defy the natural order. They're subject to the conditions of the natural world. Achilles can't, as strong as he is and as superior he is to other men, he can't pass through walls. He can't do divine things. He's not above nature. Next one is low mimesis. Fourth category. It's the level of the classical novel. Let's say of Jane Austen. I guess that's the one that most people here would be familiar with. Say a Jane Austen novel. The characters are on level with ourselves in abilities, but maybe not social class. So now there's a reflection of the meritocracy of Jane Austen's day. These characters are like us, but actually we're talking about people that are of a better social rank. But as persons, they're not morally superior. They're supposed to be, but they aren't necessarily. So it's the modern novel talking about everybody in egalitarian terms, more or less, other than there's a social rank, but the social rank doesn't reflect their actual personal superiority. Whereas here in High Mimesis, when we meet Odysseus, he is godlike Odysseus. He is better than we are. And so is Achilles, and so is Aeneas. But he's not above his environment. Now, when we come to the Low Mimesis, this tends to be characteristic of the novel. So fictional type is the novel, modern novel. Here it will be epic, tragedy. The fifth and final is the ironic. The ironic, and this is the lowest of the categories, we see ourselves looking down on people who are weaker, more ignorant, and maybe even morally inferior to ourselves, but think that they're not. So we're looking down. There's an irony. We're looking down on other people who claim greatness for themselves but don't have it. So the heroes then, here, so it's not equal, they're lower in abilities. And we look down on them, and the heroes of these things become anti-heroes. Bart Simpson. There you go. Is it not ironic? Oh yes, it is. It all is, and nobody misses it. By the way that fathers are portrayed in all contemporary movies, films, father is a buffoon. The ironic portrait is always there. We're looking down on